The bells of St. Jude's chimed midnight, their heavy bronze tolls swallowed by the relentless London rain that turned the cobblestones into mirrors of black glass. Inside her cramped shop, Elara Thorne was a woman out of time. Her world was measured in the scent of linseed oil, the intricate grain of ancient mahogany, and the delicate, patient restoration of things the world had deemed broken and discarded. She was currently hunched over his 17th-century writing desk, her fingers tracing the fine inlay, when the back door didn't just open. It shattered inward under the weight of a dying man. Kalen Vance collapsed against her workbench, bringing with him the sharp smell of ozone and the heavy, metallic copper of fresh blood. His bespoke charcoal suit, worth more than Alara's entire inventory, was ruined by a blooming crimson stain spreading across his abdomen like a dark flower. Elara didn't scream. In the stifling silence of the shop, her survival instincts, honed by a lifetime of being the invisible daughter of a woman who taught her how to hide in plain sight, kicked in with icy precision. She didn't reach for a phone. She reached for the only heirloom she possessed, her mother's vintage silk scarf, patterned with faded thorn roses. She knelt in the blood, pressing the silk hard against the jagged wound. Kalen's hand, cold as a winter grave, shot up and clamped around her wrist. His eyes, a piercing, flinty gray, locked onto hers with a mixture of agony and predatory suspicion. "You shouldn't have done that," he hissed, his voice a low, dangerous rasp that seemed to vibrate the very tools on her wall. "By stopping this blood, you've signed your name in it. You think you're a savior? To my world, you're a witness. And witnesses are liabilities that usually don't see the sunrise." Elara didn't flinch. She leaned in, her face inches from the man the tabloids called the Iron Duke. "If I wanted you dead, I would have let you bleed out on the floor. Now, hold the scarf or die. I have a desk to finish." In that moment, the air in the room shifted. Kalen saw something in her eyes, not the fear he was accustomed to, but a weary, regal defiance that suggested she had faced monsters far worse than him. He didn't know yet that the scarf she used to bind his wound was a piece of the throne he had stolen. He only knew that for the first time in his life, a liability had made him feel a flicker of something dangerously close to hope. The sunrise over London was a bruise-colored smear against a leaden sky, but Elara didn't see it. She saw only the flickering orange tongues of flame licking the windows of her life. The shop, the smell of old wood, the quiet sanctuary of a workbench, was gone. In its place stood a blackened skeleton of ash and the stinging scent of chemical accelerant. Kalen Vance stood 10 feet away, silhouetted against the smoldering ruins. He looked entirely out of place in the grime of the East End, his ruined suit replaced by a fresh, midnight blue overcoat that made him look like a statue carved from shadows. He didn't offer a hand. He didn't offer an apology. He simply watched the smoke rise as if he were observing a business transaction. "They found you faster than I anticipated," Kalen said, his voice a low, melodic vibration that cut through the crackle of the remaining embers. "Julian's men don't leave witnesses, Elara. By pressing that scarf to my side, you didn't just save a man. You stepped into the crosshairs of a war you aren't equipped to fight." Elara clutched her coat tighter, her knuckles white. "I had a life, hey. I had a name." "You had a target on your back," he corrected, turning to face her. His gray eyes were devoid of empathy, fixed on her with the cold calculation of a man assessing a failing asset. "In my world, you are a liability, a loose end that my enemies will use to get to me, or a witness the police will use to dismantle my board. Both options end with you in a shallow grave." He signaled, and a heavy black sedan glided to the curb like a shark in dark water. The door opened, revealing an interior of clinical, leather-scented silence. "You have two choices," Kalen continued, stepping closer until the heat from the fire behind her was matched by the chilling intensity of his presence. "You can stay here and wait for the men who miss me to find you. Or you come with me. You move into my estate. You stay where I can see you, breathe the air I allow you to breathe, and play the part of my fiancé to explain why the Iron Duke is suddenly harboring an outsider. You become my shield, and in exchange, I become yours." "A fiancé?" Alara's voice was a jagged edge. You want to turn me into a prop. I want to turn you into a ghost, Kalen hissed, his hand briefly touching her arm, a grip that was half restraint, half anchor. If the world thinks you belong to me, they might hesitate to kill you. If they think you're just a girl from a shop, you're already dead. Choose, Ilara. The fire is dying, and the shadows are getting hungry. Ilara looked at the ash of her mother's legacy, then at the man who had brought the fire. She stepped toward the car. She wasn't choosing safety. She was choosing a different kind of danger. The Vance estate was not a home. It was a cathedral of cold marble and silent, high-tech judgment. Located behind iron gates that looked like spears aimed at the heavens, the mansion felt as though it were designed to remind Ilara of her own insignificance. For 3 days, she had been a prisoner in silk, moved from room to room by guards who looked through her as if she were made of glass. Kalen was gone, likely liquidating the men who had burned her life to the ground, leaving her to pace the echoing hallways of the East Wing. In the center of her room sat a single cardboard box, the few charred remains the fire investigators had allowed her to salvage. Her hands, usually so steady when handling centuries-old wood, trembled as she reached inside. Most of it was charcoal and heartbreak. But at the bottom, tucked inside a soot-stained velvet pouch, was her mother's gold locket. It was a small, unassuming piece. But as Ilara used a corner of her silk robe to polish the grime from the surface, the metal began to glow with a dull, defiant luster. She clicked the latch. Inside was not a photo, but an intricate, hand-engraved crest, a thorn rose entwined with a serpent, its fangs bared. I told you to stay in your quarters. Kalen's voice hit her like a physical weight. He stood in the doorway, his silhouette blocking the light from the hall. He looked exhausted, his tie loosened and his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with tension. He strode into the room, his presence instantly consuming the oxygen. "What is that?" he demanded, his eyes dropping to her hands. "It's mine," Ilara said, instinctively closing her fist over the locket. "One of the few things your world didn't turn to ash." Kalen didn't ask. He reached out and pried her fingers open with a strength that was famed but strangely devoid of his usual cruelty. He took the locket, holding it up to the dim amber light of the bedside lamp. As his eyes traced the engraving of the thorn rose, the air in the room seemed to turn to ice. His pupils dilated, and the muscle in his jaw ticked with a violent rhythm. "Where did you get this?" His voice was no longer a rasp. It was a low, lethal growl. "It belonged to my mother," she whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. "She told me never to show it to anyone with an iron crest. She said it was a mark of a debt that could never be paid." Kalen's grip on the locket tightened until his knuckles turned white. He looked at Ilara, and for the first time, he didn't see a liability or witness. He saw a ghost. He recognized that crest. It was the seal of the Thorn Architects, the family his father had claimed to have exterminated to secure the Vance Syndicate's monopoly over the city's skyline. The man who lived by cold logic felt the ground beneath his feet begin to crumble. He had brought the one person into his home who could dismantle his entire legacy with a single piece of jewelry. He looked at her, this beautiful, resilient woman he had treated like a burden, and realized he wasn't her protector. He was her jailer, occupying a throne that belonged to her. The shard pierced the London fog like a glass needle, and on the 72nd floor, the air was thick with the scent of lilies and old money. Kalen had spent 2 hours watching a team of stylists transform Ilara into something she didn't recognize. Clad in a gown of midnight emerald silk that draped over her curves like liquid shadows, she looked less like a restorer and more like a revolution. "Remember the rules," Kalen whispered as the elevator doors hissed open. He leaned down, his lips brushing the shell of her ear, a gesture that looked intimate to the security cameras but felt like a warning to her. "You are my fiancé. You are devoted, you are elegant, and above all, you are silent. If you speak, you give them a thread to pull. And Julian is looking for a reason to unravel us both." Ilara felt the weight of the diamonds at her throat, a heavy, cold collar provided by the Vance vaults. "You're afraid," she murmured, meeting his flinty gaze in the reflective gold of the elevator wall. "For the first time since I met you, You're terrified of what I might say." Kalen didn't answer. He led her into the ballroom, his hand a firm, possessive heat at the small of her back. The room went quiet. The Van Syndicate was built on bloodlines and pew alliances. The arrival of a black American woman on the arm of the Iron Duke was a seismic event. The whispers began, sharp, jagged sounds that cut through the classical music. A liability, a distraction, a mistake. But as they moved through the crowd, the narrative shifted. Ilara didn't cower. She moved with a regal, innate poise that had been forged in the fire of her shop and the quiet dignity of her mother's lessons. When the elderly board members approached, she didn't just nod. She spoke of the neoclassical architecture of the room with a precision that silenced them. She wasn't playing a part. She was reclaiming a space. Across the room, Julian Vane watched them, a glass of vintage scotch in his hand and a predatory smile on his face. He began to weave through the crowd, a wolf in a tuxedo. "Kalen," Julian purred, stopping just inches from them. His eyes raked over Ilara with a disgusting, calculating hunger. "You finally brought the girl from the gutter to the clouds. Tell me, dear, does he treat you like a queen, or just a very expensive witness?" Kalen's grip on Ilara's waist tightened, his knuckles turning white. The Iron Duke was usually a master of apathy, but as Julian leaned toward Ilara, Kalen's mask cracked. A low, guttural growl started in his chest. "She is the future of this house, Julian," Kalen said, his voice echoing with a lethal finality. "And you are the past. Choose your next words carefully. They might be your last." The room held its breath. The liability was no longer a burden. She had become the pivot point upon which the entire Vance empire was beginning to turn. Kalen realized with a jolt of adrenaline that he wasn't protecting her for the Syndicate anymore. He was protecting her from it. Emotion, vindication. Ilara's natural grace begins to eclipse the aristocrats, shifting the power. The gala's air had grown stifling, a cocktail of expensive perfume and cheap malice. Ilara managed to slip away toward the balcony, needing to feel the bite of the London wind against her skin. The city below was a carpet of shimmering lights, indifferent to the wolves in the ballroom. But the silence didn't last. The balcony door creaked, and the scent of expensive gin and clove cigarettes announced his arrival before he even spoke. "It's a long way down, isn't it?" Julian Vane leaned against the stone balustrade, his smile a serrated blade glinting in the moonlight. He didn't look at the view. He looked at Ilara with a chilling, clinical intensity. "Kalen thinks he's clever, dressing a shop girl in emeralds and calling it a crown. He thinks if he keeps you close enough, the truth stays buried." Ilara straightened her spine, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a flinch. "I'm not a secret to be kept, Julian." "Oh, but you are," Julian whispered, stepping into her personal space. "You're a ghost story that was supposed to end in 1996. You have your mother's eyes, Ilara. That same defiant spark that made her so difficult to manage." He reached out, his fingers hovering just inches from the thorn rose locket hidden beneath a gown. "But you didn't just bring yourself into this house, did you? My scouts are very thorough. They found a charming little cottage in the countryside. A girl named Mila. She has your eyes, too." The world tilted. The cold of the wind was nothing compared to the ice that flooded Ilara's veins. Her secret, the daughter she had hidden to keep Pew from this world's filth, was no longer hers. "If you touch her," Ilara's voice was a jagged shard of glass. "I won't have to," Julian interrupted, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. "But the council, they have very strict rules about liabilities and the mess they leave behind. Unless, of course, that liability is removed before the board meeting tomorrow." Before Ilara could react, a shadow detached itself from the doorway. Kalen moved with the silent, predatory speed of a man born to kill. In one fluid motion, he had Julian pinned against the stone railing, his hand clamped around his brother's throat. The Iron Duke was gone. In his place was a monster of raw, unbridled fury. "Mention the child again," Kalen hissed, his voice so low it was almost a vibration. "And I will not just kill you, Julian. I will erase every trace that you ever breathed." I will burn your legacy until there is nothing left but ash for the wind. Julian gasped for air, his face turning a mottled purple, but he kept grinning. He had won the opening gambit. He had found the one thing that could make the Iron Duke lose his legendary composure. Kalen shoved Julian away and turned to Alara. His eyes were no longer flint. They were a storm of guilt and terrifying possessiveness. He realized then that the war had shifted. It was no longer about a debt or a letter. It was about a 4-year-old girl he had never met, who carried the blood he was sworn to protect, and the woman who had become the only thing in the world worth saving. The return to the Vance estate was a journey in suffocating silence. The reinforced glass of the sedan acted as a barrier against the world, but inside, the air was thick with the scent of Kalen's cold fury. The moment the tires hit the gravel of the driveway, the Iron Duke took command. He didn't wait for the valet. He rounded the car and hauled the door open, his grip on Alara's hand unyielding. "You're moving," he said, his voice a flat, dead calm that was more terrifying than a shout. "I have a room, Kalen," Alara protested, stumbling slightly as he led her toward the grand staircase. "No, you have a target on your back in the East Wing," he snapped, not looking back. "Julian knows about Mila. That changes the geography of this house. From this second, you don't breathe unless I hear it. You don't sleep unless I'm the one guarding the door." He didn't take her back to the guest quarters. He led her into the master's suite, a cavernous, brutalist space of charcoal velvet and cold steel. He slammed the heavy oak doors, the locks engaging with a series of electronic clicks that sounded like a prison sentence. "You lied to me," Kalen growled, finally turning to face her. He began to pace the length of the room like a caged panther, his tuxedo jacket discarded, his white shirt strained across his shoulders. "You let me call you a liability while you were hiding a second Thorn bloodline in the countryside. Do you have any idea what Julian will do to a 4-year-old to get to the Thorn Rose? I was protecting her from you." Alara shouted, her own fear finally exploding into rage. "Your family spent 20 years trying to erase mine. Why would I trust the son of the man who murdered my mother's peace?" Kalen stopped. He crossed the distance between them in 2 strides, his hands coming up to frame her face. His touch was electric, a desperate, possessive heat that contradicted the coldness of his words. "Because I am the only monster in this city capable of keeping the other monsters away from her," he whispered, his thumbs tracing the line of her jaw. The anger in the room shifted, warping into a heavy, jagged tension. Kalen didn't pull away. He looked at her with a raw, agonizing hunger, realizing that his mercy wasn't about the syndicate anymore. He wasn't guarding an asset. He was guarding a woman who had somehow made his cold, iron heart beat with a terrifying, forbidden rhythm. He stayed by the door all night, a silhouette of silver and shadow, realizing he would burn every bridge he had built just to keep the world from touching her. The mansion was a cemetery of secrets at 3 in the morning. Kalen had finally succumbed to an uneasy sleep in the armchair by the door, his hand still resting on the grip of his holster even in slumber. Alara watched the rhythmic rise and fall of his chest, her heart a frantic bird against her ribs. She knew this was her only window. If Kalen was the shield, the truth was the sword, and she needed to find it. She slipped out of the master suite with the ghost-like silence she'd learned as a child on the run. The East Wing's biometric locks were formidable, but Alara wasn't just a waitress or a restorer. She was an artist of mechanics. Using a small kit of dental picks and a high-frequency bypass she'd scavenged from Kalen's own security drawer, she whacked the keypad. With a soft, hydraulic hiss, the heavy oak doors, sealed since the year her mother fled London, creaked open. The air inside was stagnant, tasting of dry rot and 20 years of silence. It wasn't a living space. It was a drafting room. Dust motes danced in her flashlight beam, illuminating rows of architectural tables and vellum scrolls. Alara's breath hitched. On the central desk lay the original blueprints for the Vance Tower, the very building that stood as a monument to Kalen's power. But the signature in the bottom right corner wasn't Vance. It was Thorn. "You were the architect," she whispered, her fingers trembling as they traced her mother's elegant, cursive script. "He didn't build this city. He stole it." In a false bottom beneath the drafting table, she felt a click. A hidden compartment slid open, revealing a leather-bound folio. Inside was the first half of a blood-stained letter, dated June 1996. It wasn't a business contract. It was a confession of a blood debt owed by the Vance family to the Thorn line, a debt that suggested the entire syndicate was merely a trust being held until the rightful heir returned. The weight of the legacy hit her like a physical blow. She wasn't a liability because she was a witness. She was a liability because she was the landlord. She heard the faint sound of a floorboard creak behind her. The Iron Duke didn't stay asleep for long. The silence of the drafting room was shattered not by a voice, but by the sharp, rhythmic thud-thud-thud of a helicopter blade slicing the night air, followed by the crystalline scream of breaking glass. The East Wing's conservatory was being liquidated. Down! Now! Kalen's voice was a thunderclap. He didn't come through the door. He seemed to materialize from the shadows, his silk shirt unbuttoned, his eyes blazing with a feral, protective light. Before Alara could tuck the blood-stained letter into her bodice, he had swept her off her feet. He didn't run for the exit. He surged toward the back wall of the study, slamming his palm against the decorative molding. A section of the mahogany paneling hissed open, revealing a vertical slip of darkness. He shoved her inside just as a hail of suppressed gunfire shredded the vellum blueprint she had been touching seconds before. The safe room was a concrete coffin lined with monitors and emergency oxygen. Kalen slammed the door, the steel bolts engaging with a finality that made the air feel suddenly, dangerously thin. The room was no larger than a walk-in closet. The proximity was brutal. Alara could feel the heat radiating from Kalen's skin, the frantic drum of his heart against her shoulder as he leaned over the monitors, his breath coming in jagged hitches. Julian's men, he rasped, watching the grainy thermal feeds of masked figures moving through his home, is not waiting for the board, is burning the evidence. The evidence is me, isn't it? Alara's voice cracked. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a cold, hollow terror. She looked at the letter in her hand, then at the man who was currently reloading a sidearm with mechanical precision. My mother didn't run because of a crime, Kalen. She ran because your father was a thief. This room, this house, the very air you breathe, it's all stolen. Kalen froze. He turned to her, the blue glow of the monitors casting ghoulish shadows across his face. I know, he whispered. The confession was a jagged confession that seemed to tear his throat. I've known since I took the chair. Why do you think I labeled you a liability? Why do you think I've kept you in this gilded cage? It wasn't to keep the world from finding you, Alara. It was to keep you from finding this. He gestured to the room, to the Empire, to himself. For the first time, the Iron Duke looked small. In the suffocating intimacy of the bunker, the power dynamic shifted. He wasn't the king protecting a peasant. He was the usurper standing before the rightful queen in a concrete tomb. The raid on the estate hadn't been an assassination attempt. It was a surgical extraction of Alara's peace. By the time the sun began to bleed over the horizon, Julian's men had retreated, leaving behind a message more devastating than any bullet. On the scarred mahogany desk in Kalen's study sat a single, pristine courier envelope. Inside lay the missing piece, the second half of the 1996 letter. Julian had intended this to be Alara's death warrant. He believed that once Kalen saw the legal finality of the Thorn claim, his survival instinct would override his burgeoning obsession. Julian expected Kalen to do what any Vance would, eliminate the threat. Kalen stood by the window, the morning light catching the jagged lines of his face. He held the two halves of the letter together. The jagged tear in the paper vanished, revealing the full, chilling truth. To the heir of the rose, the Vance name is a mask. This empire was built on the theft of your mother's vision and the blood of your father's silence. By the laws of the old debt, the seat of the Iron Duke belongs to you. If the Vances refuse to bow, the city must fall. Alara watched him from the doorway, her hands trembling. She expected the Iron Duke to turn on her. She expected the cold click of a safety being disengaged. Instead, Kalen let the paper flutter to the desk as if it were lead. He wants me to kill you, Alara, Kalen said, his voice a hollow echo of its former authority. He turned to her, and for the first time, his eyes were wet. He thinks the crown is more important than the woman. He thinks I'd rather be a king of thieves than a man who earns your forgiveness. He picked up his phone, his thumb hovering over a contact. He sent this to provoke a murder. But he forgot one thing. I've seen the way you look at Mila. I've seen the way you fix that desk in the shop, with a patience that only comes from loving things that are broken. He looked at her, the letter between them acting as a bridge over 20 years of lies. Julian thinks I'll kill the liability. He doesn't realize I've already decided to become your sod. The high-rise boardroom of Vance Tower was a cathedral of glass and cold ambition, overlooking a London that looked like a toy set from 74's up. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cigars and the sharp, metallic tang of Fay. Julian Vane stood at the head of the mahogany table, his hands splayed across the surface as if he already owned the grain. Around him sat the council, 12 elders of the underground, men who value tradition more than life and blood purity more than profit. The Iron Duke has rusted. Julian's voice rang out, dripping with a rehearsed, sorrowful venom. He has brought a thorn into our inner sanctum, not as a prisoner, but as a guest. He has compromised our security, endangered our assets, and turned the Vance name into a punchline for a waitress's amusement. The elders murmured, their faces etched with the deep lines of a century of shadow wars. Julian leaned in, dropping his voice to a conspiratorial hiss. He is no longer fit for the chair. He protects a liability while the city burns. I move for a vote of no confidence. I move for the liquidation of the Thorn Interloper and the removal of the man who failed to erase her. The heavy double doors at the end of the hall didn't just open. They were thrown wide by two guards who looked terrified to even be touching the handles. Kalen Vance walked into the room. He wasn't wearing his usual armor of a three-piece suit. He wore a simple black shirt, sleeves rolled up, revealing the scars on his forearms, marks of every battle he'd fought to keep these very men rich. Elara walked 2 steps behind him, her head held high, the thorn rose locket pinned openly to the lapel of her coat. "Ueli, Julian," Kalen said, his voice a low, lethal vibration that seemed to rattle the crystal carafes on the table. He didn't look at the council. He kept his eyes locked on his brother. "And you're sitting in my chair." "It's not your chair anymore, Kalen," Julian sneered, though his hand twitched toward the concealed holster under the table. "The council has seen the evidence. You've traded our legacy for a woman." Kalen didn't argue. He didn't shout. He walked to the center of the table and laid the 2 halves of the 1996 letter down, joining them perfectly. "I haven't traded the legacy," Kalen said, his gaze finally sweeping over the elders, chilling them into silence. "I've finally found the person it actually belongs to. You want to talk about liabilities? The greatest liability this house has ever known is the lie we've been living for 20 years. The room went deathly still. The elders recognized the seal. They recognized the debt. Julian's face turned a mottled, ugly purple. He realized that Kalen wasn't defending himself. He was abdicating in a way that would destroy Julian's chance at a clean takeover. The Iron Duke was burning the throne down while Julian was still trying to sit on it. The border was a vacuum of sound. The city's lights twinkled indifferently outside the glass. But inside, the air was heavy with the scent of an ending. Julian's hand hovered near his weapon, his face twisted in a mask of desperation. "Kill her!" Julian screamed at the guards, his voice cracking with the realization that his coup was dissolving into a confession. "She's a ghost. She has no standing here. Kalen, you've lost your mind. You're handing our blood to a waitress." Kalen didn't even look at his brother. His eyes remained fixed on Elara, who stood amidst the most dangerous men in Europe with a quiet, devastating dignity. He saw the fire in her eyes, the same fire that had allowed her to tie a silk scarf around a stranger's wound in a dark alley. In a move that shattered every rule of the Vance Syndicate, the Iron Duke took a step back from the head of the table. He didn't reach for his gun. He didn't bark an order. Instead, he let out a long, ragged breath, and slowly, deliberately, his knees hit the hardwood floor with a hollow, echoing thud. The council gasped as one. Julian froze. Kalen Vance, The man who had never apologized, never yielded, and never showed a second of weakness, was on his knees before Ilara Thorne. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the ancient signet ring of the Vance house, the heavy gold band that signified absolute command. He didn't hold it out like a gift. He held it up like an offering. "My father stole your mother's vision," Kalen said, his voice thick with a raw, agonizing sincerity that stripped him bare. "He labeled you a liability to justify his theft. I kept you a prisoner to protect my own conscience. But the letter doesn't lie, and neither does my heart." He looked up at her, the blue-gray of his eyes reflecting a newfound, desperate loyalty. "I am not your protector, Ilara. I'm your first subject. The Thorn Rose is the only law I recognize. Take the ring, take the house, and if you wish it, take my life for the 20 years of silence we forced upon you." Ilara looked down at the man who had once terrified her, the man she had labeled a monster. In the silence of that boardroom, she didn't see a Mafia king. She saw a man who had finally broken his own chains to free her. She didn't take the ring immediately. She reached out and placed her hand on his shoulder. "Stand up, Kalen," she whispered, her voice carrying across the silent council members like a command from a higher power. "A king doesn't bow, but a queen needs a general she can trust." The silence following Kalen's rise was broken by the sound of Julian's chair screeching against the floor. Desperation had finally replaced his arrogance. He lunged for the signet ring, his hand clawing at the mahogany table. But Kalen didn't even have to draw his weapon. The council elders, men who lived by the code of the old debt, stood as one, their cold gazes shifting from the disgraced brother to the woman who held Kalen's hand. "The debt is acknowledged," the eldest council member spoke, his voice like grinding stone. "The Thorn Rose returns to the garden. Julian Vane, you are excised." Guards moved with clinical efficiency, dragging a screaming Julian from the room. His reign ended not with a bang, but with a heavy thud of the boardroom doors closing behind him. The transition was swift, but the victory was quiet. A week later, the Vance estate, no longer a fortress of secrets, was bathed in the soft, golden light of a London spring. The high-tech security was still there, but the forbidden wing had been thrown open. The drafting tables were once again covered in vellum, and the scent of linseed oil and fresh cedar filled the halls. Kalen stood on the balcony, his hand resting on the stone balustrade where Julian had once threatened his world. He looked different. The Iron Duke mask had softened into something human. Behind him, the sound of laughter echoed through the gardens. Mila, finally brought home, was chasing a golden retriever through the manicured hedges, her small, joyful cries a defiant melody against the house's dark history. Ilara stepped out to join him, wearing a simple white dress and the Thorn Rose signet on her finger. She wasn't just a restorer of furniture anymore. She was the architect of a new era. The board meeting went well. Kalen asked, his voice low and full of a newfound, quiet devotion. "They've agreed to the social housing projects," Ilara replied, leaning her head against his shoulder. "And the restoration of the East End. We're building things that belong to the people, Kalen, not just things that belong to the shadows." Kalen looked down at her, then out at the child playing below, the future of the Rose. He had spent his life believing that pure blood was his strength and liabilities were his weakness. He realized now that he had it backward. The woman he had tried to control had ended up being the only thing that could save him from himself. "I spent my life guarding a crown that didn't fit," Kalen whispered, pulling her closer. "I'd rather be the man who guards your peace." The Dragon of the Hand and the Iron Duke were myths of the past. In their place stood a new dynasty, one built on a mother's letter, a restored birthright, and a love that had survived the fire. The final payoff, vindication and justice. The Thorn legacy is not just restored, but redeemed, and the liability has become the heart of the empire.